Welcome to a special edition of Everything is a Primary Source podcast. I am Eric Paul. I'm joined today by the tie-dyed Librarian, and we are going to use this time to do a report out from this weekend's 90s Con in Hartford, Connecticut that we attended. And one thing that we learned right away, I'm sure you can agree, is that we are not con people. It was not really exactly what we expected. It was something I could tell a lot of people enjoy, but to borrow from a quote from a 90s character, Austin Powers, is not my bag, baby. So what was your reaction as soon as you saw what we were dealing with?
I don't know. I guess I wouldn't say it was shock. It was just kind of like maybe frustration because, we took time out of our weekend to drive there, which was a couple hours away. So to be greeted by like lines that were going out of the building, out of the parking garage into the snow coming down, it was like, oh, okay. This is not exactly the welcome that we were hoping for.
Yeah. I mean, I having only known about cons, conventions by way of coverage that you see, usually you get a picture or two on Instagram or Facebook of people in their cosplay costumes at Comic-Con or at, different events. And in the background, you kind of see people milling around. I didn't picture it to be as huge as it was. So the experience, and as we were in the lines, I heard a gentleman actually put it well. He's like, this is kind of like a video game. It was almost like a video game from the 90s where you had different stages to get through and to, before. So there's at least 3 or 4 lines before you actually got into the actual con itself. And the reason we went in the first place is because, we're always looking for things to do that are different and interesting. But this was going to be the very first time that much of the cast of Full House was going to reunite after Bob Saget had passed away a few weeks ago. And you're a pretty big Full House fan, so Hartford's not terribly far away, so you said, hey, let's go see what that's about, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's a West Coast show, and obviously most of the people live on the West Coast in LA or around there. So I don't know how frequently they come to the East Coast. I just figured, well, it's Connecticut, it's not that far, let's go.
Yeah, and I did a podcast last week with Professor Brian Greenfield, a history professor who focuses on antiquities, antiques, colonial revivalism is what we talked about, and how we could compare it with that hyper nostalgia that I think a lot of people are feeling. And I could feel that when we got there. I mean, I went basically because I was like, well, great opportunity to make connections for this podcast, talk to people, get to know potentially other podcasters that deal with the same kind of subject. And, I saw on the list of people that were there, more than a few that I was interested in. And, we ended up chatting with and getting pictures taken with the woman who played Harriet Winslow on Family Matters, and also Danny Tamborelli, who is in a number of shows from the 90s, including The Adventures of Pete and Pete. He's Little Pete. And he was a great guy, super friendly. He gave our son a autographed picture of his character from the Magic School Bus. And it seemed like some of the celebrities there, they've been there, they knew their way around the con and how it worked, because it seemed like their lines are moving along. But it just intrigued me, if nothing else, especially after time and distance went by, how we waited in line for hours to try to get autographs and pictures. And we were getting frustrated, but it seemed like a lot of people, they were just perfectly fine with it. They're like, yeah, this is just part of it. And I'm willing to spend hundreds of dollars to meet people. And I still couldn't wrap my head around that mentality. It was just kind of a odd thing. Did you find it weird too, to have so many people are just like, I want to pay money, and just
Well, I think you and I both commented on the fact that some of those people seem to be dealers.
yeah,
Like we definitely saw a few people that were getting autographs, and it seemed more like because they were trying to resell them and collect as many as they possibly could. Like there were people flying in from Orlando, Florida, people flying in from San Francisco, California, for this, and I thought like are you really that big of a fan that you can't wait until some event is closer to you?
yeah.
But I think that some of them were doing it, as a business venture.
Right, whether they put it up on eBay or they have a store, or they go to flea markets and things like that, and they have their here's my autographed picture of Dave Coulier, and you can buy it for twice as much as I paid for it, things like that. So I mean, seems to be part of the business cycle for a lot of folks. But I have to still go back to the idea that coming out of the pandemic, that was another contributor to why it was so big, because to me, I'm thinking Hartford, Connecticut isn't really, it doesn't have the name and lights like Los Angeles or New York City or even Boston. You would think would have a bigger turnout, but like you said, we saw license plates in the parking garage from Florida. We talked to a few people who came from New Jersey and Long Island, which isn't terribly far to Hartford, but still just, and we came down from New Hampshire to see this, and we just figured it was something different, something we'd never done before, and probably won't do again, but it was definitely a sight to behold. But I think coming out of the pandemic was a big part of it, that people were trying to return to some kind of normalcy, and what better way to bring that than this time period, the 90s, which have in recent years become put on this kind of like a pedestal. People have put that 10-year span as being like the pinnacle of the good times. I was talking with, actually, I got a chance to chat with Omri Katz, who starred in the movie Hocus Pocus and a TV show in the 90s called Erie, Indiana. And, he put it well. He said, the 90s were like the last of the good times. Like that was like the golden age, and it was kind of like the last hurrah. And, I can't help but agree with that way of thinking. And so, so many people there. There was a cosplay contest, but it seemed like a lot of folks were just dressed up as 90s characters for the fun of it, kind of thing. So do you think that being in the various turbulent things that we're in right now contributed to the big turnout to 90s con? Because it's not like Comic Con or it's a particular movie or something like that. It's just a decade.
Well, definitely, people seeking some kind of normalcy, but I definitely think that the onslaught of reboots that we've been seeing has been a huge contributor to it. I mean, it wasn't just people in like their 30s and 40s that were there. There were a lot of little children there that seemed pretty happy about it, and I'm sure that they were dressed in these clothes by their parents, but I saw Full House shirts, I saw NSYNC shirts, I saw all sorts of things. Little kids dressed up like Steve Urkel, like, I mean, I know that obviously their parents probably helped them choose those outfits, or if not, asked them to wear them.
Yeah.
But I think that the availability of all these things on streaming services, like we've been binging Family Matters, that has not been rebooted, but just the availability to watch it anytime you want, through HBO Max or whatever. And then other ones that have been rebooted, and like Full House obviously being the biggest one, Fuller House. I mean, there were people dishing out like hundreds and hundreds of dollars to get their photos taken with the cast of Full House.
Yeah.
I mean, the ones that were there anyways.
Right.
So, I don't know. I mean, it's definitely a return to normalcy, and that kind of romanticizing the 90s as like the last great decade before everything was spoiled, with the internet being everywhere all the time.
Yeah.
Like, it was the infancy of AOL, when it was still an innocent thing to kind of have your screen name and, have your chat list up. Like, it was still very innocent, if you could go into a chat room, but it wasn't, that was something that you would have to seek out. It wasn't the same as having a constant barrage of ads and people messaging you, people that you might not even know or care to talk to.
Yeah.
It was just, I think there's a lot of factors that contribute to it.
It would be naive to kind of think that the internet just turned on mid-90s and stayed exactly the same throughout. I mean, it started to evolve as soon as it became commercial, and you're absolutely right about that. That there was, I mean, the internet was not as pervasive by the end of the 90s and into the early 2000s. Even by, the mid 2000s, it was still pretty subdued, to that kind of thing, that you would actually have to kind of set aside time to be online. Whereas,
well, yeah, I realized that a few years ago when I was teaching one of my classes with my 8th graders, and I asked them how often they go online or what time they spend online, and they honestly didn't know what I was talking about. They were like, "What do you mean? Like, does texting count? Does watching YouTube count? Does playing games count?" Like, they didn't understand, like, going online, because to them, they're not going online. They're always there.
Yeah.
They always have access to YouTube or games or texting their friends or whatever. It didn't even register with them. Like, they weren't being sarcastic. They honestly didn't understand what I meant, because when I was their age, if I wanted to do any of those things, there was a process to it. And it took those series of steps of, like, asking someone to hang up the phone and then plugging in the modem and then putting in your password and
hoping
waiting
it
for the
actually
thing.
got online.
Yeah, waiting for the thing to connect and then navigating your way around. Like, it just was very different. And I think that people, like to romanticize and glorify the early days of pretty much anything.
Yeah.
I mean, we have the early days of television, the early days of film, the early days of the internet. We have the early days of everything.
Well, we get to watch how people start to interact with it and, like, what catches on. There's plenty of things. I can't really think of too many examples right now, but there's plenty of things about the early internet that did not last. I mean, MySpace is one of them, but, like, there's so many of those things from the mid to early 90s that seemed completely reasonable, that it would probably be part of the thing, but from that point on, but it just didn't last at all. And it was funny going to the con about how much, as I commented to you throughout it, that it was definitely geared towards kids of the 90s, younger people of the 90s, because there was a lot of that decade that wasn't represented at. I think the closest that may have gotten was, like, Nev Campbell was, I didn't see her, but she was supposed to be there anyway. And she was on Charmed, and, right? Was she on Charmed? Yeah.
No,
I'm sorry, Party of Five.
She's not in Charmed. She's in Party of Five.
But Scream movies were the more edgier thing that she was part of. And that's one thing I recognize is it seemed like the edgy part of the 90s wasn't really represented.
Well, I think the edgy and really the more sophisticated parts, because you and I both noted that we didn't see a single reference to the TV show Frasier,
right,
which basically ran the entire length of the 90s. I mean, I know that character started on Cheers in the 80s, but the TV show Frasier, I don't remember exactly when it starts, but
I think it was.
Like, it starts in the early 90s and then it doesn't end until after the year 2000. So, I mean, that character was around for a long time.
Yeah, and he was that. I mean, that whole show matched and reflected that the more adult 90s, which was that sipping on coffee and at a coffee shop, and very I mean, he's in Seattle, which is one of the birthplaces of the internet, and with Microsoft and everything.
And
right there.
also grunge music.
Grunge music, which was huge in the 90s. The underground, and that was another thing that was really underrepresented too. I felt was that
I did see a number of Nirvana shirts.
I saw Nirvana shirts, and I saw references that way, but and not that I would expect somebody, like any of the, like, Dave Grohl isn't going to set up a spot, to take pictures of, right next to Candace Cameron or something, but. Like, so for me, you and I are separated in age by about 18 months. And being born in 1981, that puts me around 1996. I was 15. And so I feel like I experienced at least two versions of the 90s for a little bit longer than you did because of just that slight separation in ages. So, for example, I did watch Full House. I watched the TGI Friday block pretty religiously in the early part of that decade. But when I got to around 14, 15, maybe even a little bit earlier, I was kind of, I was doing other things on Friday night, or I was interested in other shows. I was watching MTV. I was watching, um, we had HBO sometimes back then. And so I'd, watch like comedy specials and stuff like that. And, so for me, the 90s kind of switched gears a little bit. And I started to be more interested in going to like independent CD stores, or hanging out with my friends at coffee shops, and with that, the whoever's serving the coffee, their artwork's on the wall, and their poetry night in the corner and stuff like that. That kind of scene was more how I remember that decade, and the pastel color ABC symbol in the corner of the TV kind of petered out for me. And that was something else with the con, that it felt it was just very centric on that component, and not really enough about.
Well, I think I didn't even see very many references to Beverly Hills 90210, which actually did start in 1990 and then ran for like 10 seasons all the way to like the millennium. So that show really did run the entire length of that decade. But I didn't even really see any references to Beverly Hills 90210. And I really think that the 90s con kind of appealed to people who were kids in the 90s.
Yeah.
Not people who were teens or young adults in the 90s as much. Because, like we said, the absence of Frasier, we didn't really see any Seinfeld references.
That's true.
Which is another big 90s thing. I did see some Friends references, although, again, since I work with middle schoolers, even the middle schoolers I work with, a lot of them know Friends, probably because of their parents. But still, Friends has kind of, stuck around a little bit more. It's still a little bit more relevant, I guess, than some of the other shows. I'm a huge fan of the Drew Carey Show. I didn't see any references to that at all.
Right. And I was wearing a Beavis and Butthead shirt.
Oh, yeah.
And the only person, I actually got compliments on it from a few people. The parking attendant, who probably saw every single person attending walking by, he actually stopped me and said, "Yours is the best shirt I've seen all day." And, you were wearing a legitimate Mighty Mighty Boss Tone shirt from the 90s. And I know it's from the 90s because I bought it in the 90s, and you've kind of taken it for yourself because I can't possibly fit it anymore. I've basically doubled the size I was in the 90s, so there's no way I'm wearing that shirt. But, nobody really seemed to be like, "Oh, cool, Mighty Mighty Boss Tones," because it was almost like there's different planes of existence in any time period.
I think the biggest representation I saw was probably the Nicktoons. I saw lots of shirts about Are You Afraid of the Dark, which I love. I was a huge fan of the Midnight Society, and I think that really cultivated my interest in scary stories and folklore and horror genres and things like that. I saw references to Doug, lots to Rugrats, Ren and Stimpy, Hey Arnold. I saw a huge representation of those early Nicktoons.
Yeah.
I was pleasantly surprised that I didn't see much about SpongeBob, because I never really considered SpongeBob part of my childhood. So I was kind of pleasantly surprised about that.
Yeah.
I think we did see some really clever cosplay. One that I did see that I really liked a lot was a young woman who was dressed up as the nanny, the Fran Drescher show. I really enjoyed that one. And that was another show that there was really no mention of, or I think that was the only reference I saw to it, which made it that much more fun because, she really stood out and she did a nice job.
If we only see a Mimi Bobek, then we would have.
Yeah, I was pretty disappointed not to see any references to Drew Carey, because I have been on kind of a personal quest for the last couple of years to find that show streaming, which is incredibly difficult. You can find the first season for sale on DVD or purchasing it through, Amazon Prime or something. But finding any of the other seasons has proven very, very difficult.
It is very hard. And it's funny because it's almost like they know that they have a cult following and they need to, kind of keep it like a secret kind of thing. And, we're not going to tonight, but, break down that show or any other program from the 90s, because they all seems to stem from Seinfeld, which I have done an episode on of the podcast about Seinfeld, of a show about nothing, where you can make entire episodes about just regular everyday stuff. But Drew Carey did something really fun where they started as kind of the Midwestern answer to Seinfeld, but then decided, hey, let's go crazy with this. Let's like bring up like ridiculous, wild stuff all the time, and
They were they really took a lot of risks with that show. I mean, I don't want to get into a whole Drew Carey tangent. We can do that another time. But I mean, the things that they chose to do, like having a like a Whose Line Is It Anyway type of episode.
mm,
They did an episode with The Sims. They did an episode with Looney Tunes, like animation and live action. I mean, they did a lot of really fun things. Not to mention, just the fact of the really elaborate opening numbers with the music and dance was a lot
yeah,
different than those really subdued, limited ones of like Seinfeld or Frasier. Just a quick little
yeah.
thing.
It
They
sounds
kind of went the exact opposite.
well. I mean,
and made these like Broadway musical type spectacle openings.
because in a lot of ways, and that's like that edgier, and maybe I shouldn't be using that word, but that like experimental side of the '90s, where that was underrepresented at the con, where it was like, let's take everything from the last 100 years and put it all together. I mean, his opening songs for the Drew Carey show, especially his the second season onward was the Vogues with 5 O'Clock World, and then he took an old '70s song and they updated it for with Cleveland Rocks, to be for their more iconic opening sequence and all that other stuff. It was very reflective of the time period outside of the network. I mean, I realized he was on network too, but like outside of the traditional of like, let's try something new. Let's, if you want to, walk around on stilts, and be a juggler, go for it. I always think of, I know you don't particularly like the show, but the very first episode of Portlandia, where they do a whole song called "The Dream of the '90s is Alive in Portland," and where they kind of talk about that more Gen X version of the '90s, not so much the millennial version of the '90s. That was all about, hey, let's do it. Let's just have some fun. Let's if you want to, run your life this way or try this out, now is the time, because we're we're in the modern era. It's exciting. So yeah, I mean, it was a fun. Now that the waiting is over, because that's what a lot of it was, is just waiting around, hoping that things would come together in our favor and everything. But now that that's passed, it was an experience to say the least. I think that what drove a lot of people to go there or to any of these cons is that feeling of like, and I have to wonder what it's like for the stars, where it's like they put themselves out there. They've been outside of their control. We can put Kimmy Gibbler on our screen at any time we want. It's going to be the same thing over and over again. It's not like we rouse her from her bed and say, get on our screen and talk to us as Kimmy Gibbler. But we can watch those over and over again. But to have them interact with us is weird. Like, it's not, it was such an interesting and unique idea. And I think that's what compelled so many people, because and just for a second to tell those stars, hey, you mean something to my life, like, because you identified with that character, right? That's why you wanted to talk to the actors.
One thing that I was going to speak to is I think for a lot of people there's almost this expectation of being able to interact with them because of the way that social media has changed everything. You can follow somebody, you can comment on their posts. If you're lucky, they'll maybe even comment back. You can tweet with different people, like people that you would never have a chance of meeting in real life. You can interact with them online. And it's much different than someone like my grandmother, who loved Clark Gable when she was a teenager. She, absolutely adored him, had his picture on her wall. She saw Gone with the Wind in the theater 7 times. But she knew she was never going to meet Clark Gable. The most she could do was look at his picture. And I guess if she really felt ambitious, maybe she could write him a letter, but she certainly wouldn't have expected one back. I mean, she knew that there was no way she was ever going to interact with that. But with people, with the way that our technology has progressed now, we know now that you do have the ability to do it.
Yeah.
You might not ever get to interact with the person you want to, if they don't respond to fans or if they kind of stay away from social media. But there are quite a few celebrities who do interact online or do, fun little live question and answer sessions every once in a while on TikTok or whatever.
Yeah.
There's an expectation now of being able to interact with them.
So this was almost like a physical version of that, where we, instead of having to be online and hoping that they see us. It's like, no, actually get in line and they will see you. And, you have that access. It, kind of reminds me, now that I think of it, is like that Chappelle Show episode where he goes into the internet. It's like, if the internet was a real place, this is what it would look like. So, that's like what this is now. If Instagram was a real place, we were there yesterday. We went around and, because it was funny because they, for the most part, kept the stars behind these curtains and they had their booths all set up. And I'm sure this is like all other cons. If we were talking to some con veterans while we were waiting in different lines, and they were having, saying stuff, one thing or another, but how the stars don't really seem to have, they just have handlers that bring them around and like, okay, now you're going over here. They don't really keep track of time themselves. And it was just so funny because it was almost like those curtained off areas where, like the cables to the internet, like, and then they just like appeared, and that's them, logging on, and they're like, okay, all right, here we go. Let's get some pictures in. And, it was just it was very unique experience. I thought it was just something I had to do, and I'm glad I did it. I'm not sure if I'd rush back to another one.
I probably wouldn't rush back to another one. I was able to get my picture taken with Andrea Barber, who obviously played Kimmy Gibbler on Full House and Fuller House. And for some reason, I guess I didn't think about it much until the last few days, but for some reason that felt really important to me because Full House was something I watched my entire time growing up, from almost the first episode all the way to the very end.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it was a show that meant a lot to me. It was, consistency, and it was like one of my dreams when I was little to go see a taping of Full House. Of course, I don't live anywhere near California, so that never happened. And then with Fuller House, I binge watched it all the time. And I always just, I don't know, I guess I just felt like if there was anyone on that show that I probably would have like gotten along with if they were real, it was probably Kimmy Gibbler. Just because she was, funny and offbeat, but still very loyal and still a very kind-hearted person. And not so much in Fuller House, but I feel like in Full House she was kind of pawned off as being like the dumb friend or whatever, and she was constantly made fun of. And I think it shows some great creative writing that in Fuller House, she wasn't made to be like just the joke again. Like she was actually written as a really successful character who's, a loving mom and still a very loyal friend, helping her friend bring up her own children, having her own business. Like, it was really kind of interesting to see that this character, which was kind of a joke for, 6 seasons or whatever, actually became one of the stars of the show and probably one of the most likable ones. I mean, like, as much as I like that show, I think some of the characters on there were, sometimes pretty shallow.
Yeah.
But I always just liked Kimmy because, she just said it like it was.
Well, I mean, somebody like that as her character when she was a kid and a teenager and stuff like that, would, if they were real, would do well in the modern era. They would do well with being able to take that kind of, the way that she saw the world and applying it to, in the case that she's in like public relations, right?
She has her own party planning event.
That's right. Yeah. So
company.
Yeah. And so, it shows a lot of thinking on the part of Fuller House to put a character like that. And, maybe one of the reasons why that reboot did a little bit better than some of the other ones. I mean, we've been just in reboot Rama the last couple of years where they're just taking shows predominantly from the 90s and just throwing them back up on TV. In some cases, it's good. Like we wanted to do one, I don't know if the ship sailed on this or not, but we were talking about doing a podcast about Bel Air.
I still wouldn't mind doing that. So let's
we won't go
that.
too much into it, but these reboots or retellings that are coming up again, it's a really interesting idea because you could just
even like companion pieces, because I do enjoy the new Wonder Years, but I don't really consider it a sequel or a reboot at all because it's not the same characters as the Wonder Years that I grew up watching. But I'm still enjoying it because it's taking the same type of storytelling technique.
Yeah. It takes place in the same
from a different
period, right?
It's the same time period, but it's obviously the family is black, so it's a different type of story from, the 1960s, 1970s. as and it takes place in the South too.
And it's actually
versus like someplace like California
yeah,
with a white family.
It's pretty admirable that they could have just had the show take place in the 90s, because that would be the approximate.
Which basically paves the way for one of the new reboots coming our way, which is that 90s show.
Yeah.
Which is a reboot of that 70s show.
Which was
was big in the 90s.
Right. Like they took on, but like the Wonder Years could have very easily said, because when that show premiered in the late 80s, that was about 20 years after it takes place. And so they could have very easily said, the Wonder Years that started in 2021 is going to, take place in 1991. They could have really gone that direction, or 2001, but they didn't. They went right back to 1968, 69, and that's pretty admirable that they did that, to show that there was more than one story going on. It wasn't just Kevin Arnold that was experiencing that time period. It was somebody else entirely. So yeah, I mean, it was quite the trip. I really enjoyed, now that we made it safely back home. There was a snowstorm that we had to contend with, that made it even more like, if we don't make it home safely, then 90s Con is really going to be,
a sore spot,
a sore chapter in our book of like, we went there for that. But in retrospect, I mean, that was the other thing too. I wanted to go see, I said, I'd be glad with any of the cast members from Family Matters, because I like that show. And now that we're rewatching it again, I'm like, it gets panned a lot for being ridiculous, especially with the storylines involving Steve Urkel. And I didn't realize how early on they did stuff like making robots and
Urkelbot.
Urkelbot and Stefan Urkel. But I'm like, I can watch it and I can tell that they're in on the joke. They're not like, everybody that's behind the show, they're not like taking it seriously. They're like, yeah, we know how ridiculous this is and it's fun. We're having fun being ridiculous with it. But we just rewatched the one that I mentioned in the last podcast about the Tuskegee Airmen. I learned that on that show. Like, I had no, when I was a kid, I had no reason to know anything about the Tuskegee Airmen. I wasn't of the age where that would be taught in school yet. And yet it was on a comedy show on a Friday night that they brought it up, and they did a nice job of explaining it. And it was kind of funny because, and I'm actually glad I didn't get to meet the guy who played Eddie, because I probably would have freaked him out with this weird connection, the way my brain works. But like in that episode, which we just watched, when the grandma is trying to talk to the kids about World War II and her husband's service and stuff like that, they're like, oh, if we want to know anything about history, we'll just watch the Wonder Years. And then later on in the episode, the guy playing the teacher is the actor that was in the Wonder Years when they put on the play of Our Town, which is a play that's set in New Hampshire. And I would have definitely made him say, all right, here's your autograph, get out of here. If I was like, maybe. I have a connection to make, please, sir. And, he'd wave security over and have me taken away. But so, yeah, it was a interesting trip. I felt like I wasn't just looking into a fishbowl. I was in the fishbowl, swimming around and getting to. I mean, there's plenty of people there that were just, that was what they do. They were willing to drive great distances. They're like, yeah, I do cons. This is my
willing
fun.
to spend hundreds, if not thousands of dollars on photo ops, autographs, merchandise.
And I suppose if you have that as part of your budget, then that's fine. I mean, that says something right there about the many, many avenues that we have for entertainment and leisure and recreation that we have nowadays. I didn't take the time, but I guess I could go back and look into the history of these conventions and just see how long. I know that they go back at least to the 70s with comic book conventions and things like that. But I think it's just the last 20 years that they've elevated to this status where it's just like everybody's there, with the photos and everything like that. But thank you, Tie-Dyed Librarian, for giving me your input on this.
Well, thank you for asking for it.
Yeah. And when they do 2020's Con in about 30 years, maybe we'll be there signing autographs and taking hologram pictures. For everybody listening, thanks for tuning in to the EPS podcast, where everything, including 90s Con and the memories of 90s Con, is a primary source. If you like what you're listening to, please consider going over to patreon.com/EPS podcast and supporting the show. Otherwise, follow us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, pretty much everywhere, and talk to you soon.